Wake up at Holiday Inn Express to a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. Count on all the hot, fresh coffee you need and an incredible breakfast buffet that has something for everyone, like eggs, cinnamon rolls, and even hot, fresh pancakes with all the toppings you crave. Next time, do yourself a favor and stay at a Holiday Inn Express with a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. So, when you wake up at Holiday Inn Express, you'll wake up happy, a part of IHG Hotels and Resorts.
And then two, it's named Yellow Mama because they painted it with the same paint that they used to make the traffic stripes on the road, like the yellow lines. That's where the yellow. If you look it up, you'll see it's a yellow chair. It's like who thought of that? Who was like, you know what this chair needs? It needs high visibility paint on it. My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH. This week we are talking about prisons. Last week it was tattoos. Learning a lot about all these different topics. As always, if you enjoy HDTH, we have a website, hdthappen.com, where 7 days a week you can find out how things happen. Over there, you will find episode transcripts as well as pictures and videos for every episode. There's also a blog written by yours truly that just kind of coincides with everything that's on that website. Let's see, a little housekeeping before we get started. What am I reading? And if you've been listening for a while, you know that instead of what am I watching beforehand, I used to do what's called what am I reading. But I said back then I'm not always reading it fast enough to always have another book that I've read for the new episodes. So I switched it to what am I watching. But recently I went back to audiobooks. I just finished Viola Davis's autobiography. I believe it's called Finding Me. And it was awesome. It was spectacular. I've always loved her as an actress, and to hear her story it was really great. To say she comes from humble beginnings is truly an understatement, and I definitely recommend it. She talks about things like she was the kid who came to school smelling like urine and body odor because she came from such really meager meek existence. And I don't know, it's just really interesting to hear someone you always wonder what happened to the smelly kid, and it's more to that. I'm not just dissolving her entire existence down to being the smelly kid in class. But I mean, you ever think about that? I mean, next time you're just thinking about your classes, I wonder. I've known a couple kids who had issues like that. I always wonder what happened to them. What happened to the smelly kids. But moving on, what am I watching? I just actually watched Bad Boys for Life, which is the third installment in the Bad Boys series. That was my first time watching this one. I didn't go to see it in the theaters when it came out. I've always been a fan of the Bad Boys franchise. This was a little bit different than the others in my opinion. It felt very blockbustery. It just felt so, just felt like I was watching one of those Fast and the Furious movies, honestly. But they pulled out all the stops for this one. There is going to be a fourth one. Not sure what spoilers I can give away. It's a 2-year-old movie, but we find out that Will Smith's character as a kid, and that kind of I think is going to be the main thing for the next movie. But that's it for what I'm watching. What am I listening to? I am listening to Hey Babe, which is always it's done by Sal Vulcano and Chris DiStefano. They talk about pop culture topics and stuff like that. They're really funny. Sal, of course, is from Impractical Jokers, if you're wondering where he's from. He also has another podcast that I listen to, which is called Taste Buds. And this is a good podcast if you like food and you like arguing, because these two guys, it's Joe DeRosa and Sal Vulcano, every week they pick two different foods and kind of battle against each other to see which one is better. Things like sandwiches versus hot dogs, or salads versus casseroles, cakes versus pies, stuff like that. They get pretty heated, but it's a good listen if you like comedy and food. Joe DeRosa is both a comedian and a restaurant owner, so it does kind of, go hand in hand with the life that he lives. As always, if I plug those episodes, those podcasts, I can plug my mini-sode, Bite-Sized Bios we have that happens every Thursday at 4:30 a.m. The most recent BSB is out right now, and it is about Grigory Rasputin. And we find out that he was a very wild individual, and he combined religion and sex in a never-before-seen way, and hopefully never seen again. But yeah, so if you like what you hear here, give us a like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It's always great, helps the pod grow. Give us 5 stars if you feel so inclined, or as I always say, if you want to give us 2 stars with some constructive criticism, that is fine as well. But without further ado, as we're known to do, here is the episode. All right, today we're going to talk about prisons. and everything that goes with the idea of incarceration and stuff like that. So the original purpose of confining a person within a prison was not to actually punish them, but it was a means of keeping them kind of detained until their actual punishment could be carried out. Incarceration in and of itself was not considered punishment until around the 14th or 15th century. Like I said, before then, there was basically just a way to hold you until whatever we decided to do with you could be figured out, which is an interesting twist on what prisons are now, whereas it's more like now, like you do a punishment, you get prison time, whereas, like your punishment now is the prison time, whereas it seems like early prisons were really more of like a waiting room for your actual punishment. Prisons were used to detain those who had fallen out of favor with rulers. They were common criminals, sometimes slaves, prisoners of war, debtors were definitely a large part of it. Incarcerations were often used to coerce the payment of debts, and they would detain those that were awaiting trial and also provide a venue for the exhibition of prisoners prior to mutilation. Basically, you could see the prisoners there before they would get messed up. So the earliest records of prisons comes from around the first millennia BC in places like Mesopotamia as well as Egypt. During those times, prisons were almost always in underground dungeons where the criminals would spend most of their time waiting their whatever actual punishment would be. One of the most notable early prisons was a Roman prison by the name of Mamertine prison. I think it's Mamertine. It was established around 640 BC, and it was located in a sewer beneath ancient Rome. So that's, like I said, a lot of these earlier ones were underground dungeon type, just kind of wet and moist and dark, like really not good places to be. And most prisons are not good places to be, but these are just places where they weren't even built for it. They were just like, what's the worst place we can put somebody? Oh, we have a sewer. Let's store them all in the sewer. But yeah, it was a large network of dungeons where they were held in bad conditions that were often contaminated with human waste. And so, as we mentioned earlier, people were sometimes put in here because they could not afford to pay their fines. And so, one of the ways that we see that the idea of prisons for their usage kind of shifts is that I believe it was the Athenians. They realized that since there are a lot of people who were they were poor, they were never going to be able to actually pay their fines. They would give them periods of imprisonment, kind of time limit sentences, basically, to say, okay, well, if you can't pay me, then you'll just be in prison for this amount of time. And that is kind of the first time we see the shift in, oh, this is just a place where we hold you until something happens to you, to actually, well, this is the punishment for your actions. This is the cause, or this is the effect from the cause. And prison in ancient Athens was known as desmotarion, which translates to place of chains, which does not sound good. Maybe we should change our name for jail and prison over here to place of chains. It just sounds so much worse. In Greece, the prisoners were usually held in isolated buildings kind of away from the town, where they could usually be visited by friends and family, and there wasn't much detention that was happening here. The main form of detention for them, where they would strap these wooden blocks around their feet, which I guess would be an early form of shackles that would just kind of prevent them from going anywhere very fast. So it's like you can kind of control them that way. And during those times, since slavery was still a accepted kind of norm and was still in fashion, most prisoners that were not actually sentenced to death were usually sold as slaves or used by the Roman government as slaves in their own workforce. And that will bring us to actually prisons in the Middle Ages, the medieval times. We'll see that a lot of the prisons at the time, or jails, were actually built inside the castles of these kingdoms. They were usually wooden jails that were built inside like a room of some sort. They were usually used to detain political prisoners as well as any other common criminals. Some of them had iron cages suspended from the ceiling. Others featured things like these prison rooms. Like they would have a room in the castle that was basically built into a prison, and so you would have tiny slit windows. They're often like maybe 7 feet above off the ground, so to make it so that no one could like jump up and escape. The toilet was typically a bucket or a hole in the floor. And that's when then the sewage would drop through that to the moat. And if you know anything about moats from castles, they were just like the most disgusting, disease-ridden, just is where all the waste and stuff went from the castle. So this is also, where some of the prisoner waste went to. And one of the most famous and oldest prisons in the world is called the Tower of London, and it is in Europe. It is a fortress and prison, and it was built, by William, Duke of Normandy. No, excuse me. Oh yeah, it was. It was built by William, Duke of Normandy when he came to London when he was fighting the British troops, I believe, right around 1066. Basically, he got here, they won the battle, and he was crowned king. And since he was not from here, he needed a place that he could use as his stronghold to kind of let the people of London know he meant business. And so, yeah, the Tower of London would go on to be a couple things: a prison, a fortress. It would it's known now as just a castle. It holds, I believe, the crown jewels over there in the UK, but it is considered to be one of the oldest prisons in the world. But London and England is one of the real pioneers of I don't know if I would call it the modern prison system, because that would put, I think what we have now is the modern prison system, but it's definitely it was created the foundation for the modern prison system. And that really comes, the first kind of legislation for that comes around in the 1100s, maybe in the early 1200s, when they make the Magna Carta. When King John, he signs the Magna Carta, which states that no man can be in prison without trial. So that does kind of create a system. I would say it doesn't create a system, but it makes if we have trials, then we definitely have to have prisons. But before prisons became what they are now, England used what was called the penal transportation system, which is really famous for how people always think Australia was made. And we did an episode on Australia, and we'll see that was a large part of it, but it's not actually the whole. It's not how Australia came to be, really. But what they would do is, if you were convicted of a crime, instead of them keeping you and housing you in England, they would send you off to one of their colonies or something like that, or maybe you would do kind of an indentured servitude. And this went on from the 1600s throughout the 1700s. The Transportation Act of 1717 made this a much more viable option for people who maybe either had lesser crimes, or as it was an alternative to the death penalty. So either you could stay and die, or you can get shipped off to some other random colony or island that they just colonized.
With Miller Mott College's online programs, you can choose when you study. Our online programs give you the flexibility to make education work with your schedule. Earn your degree without derailing your life. Visit us online at miller-mott.edu. That's miller-mott.edu.
And so penal transportation would continue on really throughout the 1700s and 1800s, but it would die off. It is important to mention that America was one of those colonies that Britain used for penal transportation. A lot of people think it was just Australia, or it was just some islands or something like that, or India or whatever, but it was actually, they sent them, and that's why they started to die off. You look at the 1770s, that's when America started to go for its independence, so it's not a coincidence that that's when penal transportation started to kind of become less of the norm. And so once this happened, they had to start to make accommodations for actual prisoners to be held on site in their country. And so what they did was, initially they would put prisoners on ships. And so they had been called, these ships were called hulks, and they were just big ships that would just sit off the coast of, on the docks of the towns and the cities, and that's where the initial prisoners were. I would say that's probably the initial idea of modern prisons comes from that. And this is also where people start to see the idea that this is where people see the idea of housing people for just to be in jail. Like we said earlier, the initial idea of prison and jail was to hold you until something else happened, but now that this is being seen as a viable way to just hold people who have done bad things, and they see that they can get things out of them. I mean, you can also you incarcerate them so they're not on the streets, not with the public. You can also get forced labor out of them, which is something that is can be used for the state. So people see it as a win-win, really. And we'll see the same kind of actions put into place over in the colonies before America even becomes fully America. As we say, London is the birthplace of the modern prison system in the world, essentially, and in America, Pennsylvania is kind of the birthplace of the modern prison system in America. In 1786, the state of Pennsylvania passed a law that mandated that all convicts who had not been sentenced to death would be placed in penal servitude to do public work projects such as building roads, forts, and mines. And so they thought that besides the economic benefits of providing a free source of hard labor, the proponents of the new penal code also thought that this would deter criminal activity by making them an example, basically. So now you can be seen to be doing, if you're the guy building the roads, it's like the chain gang. Like you still see this kind of now on the side of the road. You drive past, and that doesn't happen as much as it used to, but you'll see a line of prisoners working on something or picking up trash on the side of the road, and it is a form of public embarrassment, even though they try to make it seem like it's for your own good. It's like it really does come from like a 200 or 300-year-old idea of, you do something bad. If we embarrass you about it, maybe you'll do it less. And so, but what actually happened in the early times is when people would see these prisoners doing stuff on the side of the road, and getting bad treatment from their overseers or whoever, and they began to feel sorry for them. So they garnered a large amount of sympathy during this time, and that is what actually led to, I believe it was a man named Benjamin Rush, who was a reformer at the time. He came up with the idea to remove the prisoners from the public eye and put them in kind of faraway, secluded areas called houses of repentance, aka prisons. Where they could be subjected to, watchfulness, labor, bodily pain, solitude, and silence. The main five. And the public wouldn't have to worry about how sad they became because they wouldn't have to see these people do anything. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's essentially what drives the idea of the modern prison system in America. And so they put this into theory, and the first and oldest jail basically in America is it's on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, and it was made in 1790. And it was modeled on what would become known as the Pennsylvania system, or the separate system, when it placed all prisoners in solitary cells with nothing more than literature, and they were made to wear prison uniforms. So this really is, like I said, this is where the beginning of American prisons come from. If you've ever looked at a prison and wondered, how did we get here? How did we go from dungeons and people in sewers in the Roman times to just a building with just cells in it? It is known as the Pennsylvania system, and it was created about 240 years ago. And so we really see that prisons operate at a state level and at lower levels for I would say almost the next 100 years or so, give or take. We see that right after the Civil War becomes when it becomes the nation's first real prison boom. And this is when the number of Black Americans in incarceration starts to surge and go do pretty high numbers. And this was the result of two different things. Sociologists think it was first that there was public anxiety and fear about the crime stemming from the newly freed Black Americans who just came out of slavery, and then there was an economic depression that came from the war, and also just the loss of all of this free labor that a country had for the last 200, 300 years, the slaves. And so that led to just a large amount of people doing crimes and getting put away. And so the U.S. Government establishes the prison system in 1891. And this is done, I remember, with the first prison in America happens on Walnut Street in 1790. So like I said, for 100 years, it was kind of just, you handle it, and whatever state handles their prisons, the way they want to. And it isn't around that time where the federal government steps in, and the first federal prison is in Leavenworth, Kansas, and it starts in 1906. But before that, it had been a military prison, but as far as it becoming a actually federally sanctioned prison that holds federal prisoners, that did not happen until, like I said, 1906. And it was this the act that created the U.S. prison system is called the Three Prisons Act. And as of today, the amount of federal prisoners sits at about 183,820 inmates in 122 institutions, I believe it is. And they said, I watched a documentary, you never know, how true these things are, but they say America houses the largest amount of inmates of any country in the world, which I find to be astonishing, just off sheer numbers. They say we beat out China, and China has like 3, almost to 4 times the amount of people that we do. Which, obviously China's not doing everything right, but those numbers don't seem to. Those numbers don't give you a warm and fuzzy. But we'll move from prisons. We'll move from prisons in America to prisons around the world. And then we're going to talk about, I believe, capital punishment, and all that entails. Got some information for you about the electric chair, lethal injection, all that good stuff. But before we get there, like I said, we're going to talk about prisons around the world. And so in Russia, specifically in Moscow, the prison system is known as the Zone, which is just very ominous. I don't like that. And there are typically more than 100 inmates jammed into a cell that may be supposed to hold maybe 20 or maybe even less than that. So many so that they have to take turns sleeping on the bunks, and some people get relegated to the floor. But the Russians see this as a way of breaking the inmates and causing them to turn on one another, which encourages beatings in the cells, which I don't know why that's positive. It says that almost everybody that lives in Moscow knows somebody that's been to prison. That's an interesting statistic to have. And then we get to France, specifically in Paris, France. In Paris, France is the home of La Sante prison, and it is known as a very brutal place. And I can only imagine a French prison. I'm not making fun of French people, but they just seem so, they're so classy. Must be wild to see just a crazy wild French prison. This prison is specific for making a hierarchy system. Interestingly enough, they say a lot of the inmates in that prison are from the Rwandan genocide that happened back in 1994, which is a very very interesting topic to get into. It may even get covered on this podcast at some point. But then let's see. We have this I thought was really interesting. I believe it is in Amsterdam. Yeah, I believe it was the Dutch, and so the Dutch basically they've changed their the way they look at crimes, or the way they treat the punishment of crimes, and they've used different things like community service or ankle monitoring, stuff like that. It's lowered, or it's actually, I guess, heightened their recidivism. I'm not sure which way it goes. Like, they have less people that are coming back to prison, so they'll have these huge. They don't have enough prisoners for their prisons, basically. So they have a bunch of empty prisons, and so what you'll find is companies will buy these prisons and renovate them into hotels, and so you can go over to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, and possibly stay in an old prison that's not been turned into a hotel, which is just a good problem to have. A lot of other countries don't have that issue, especially not in America, where overcrowding is a large problem. But it's not just America; it's a lot of countries in South America as well, and even in Asia. And so that will bring us to solitary confinement. So now, the notion of controlling inmates by isolating them was first developed in the 1700s by Quaker prison reformers. Like we said, back in the late 1700s, they made the first prison. The first prison was basically solitary confinement. It was made with single solitary cells for the inmates. And so, but what I'm seeing here is actually, so there was, when it was first made, I guess they did have like almost a common a gen pop sort of situation, and then they made 16 more cells on the side of the prison that was specifically for solitary confinement. And they were made so that the people in there could not communicate with anybody, basically. And they were never put to work. They weren't used for labor. They were basically in there to think and contemplate on their crimes, so that they can become penitent, and repent. And that's where we get the idea of the penitentiary, really. And so we really do see, Pennsylvania as being the pioneer in solitary confinement. They create the Eastern State Penitentiary in the 1820s, and that was made to keep people in solitary confinement. And then it spreads from there on up into New York at the Auburn Prison, also in the 1820s. They even did studies on solitary confinement more than almost 200 years ago. So I think the idea that people didn't know that solitary confinement was bad for the human mind, I do think is we'll find that it's just not true, because the guy who basically created the idea for the first prison also did a study about 30 or 40 years later on solitary confinement in a Pennsylvania penitentiary. And so the experiment basically, it just exposed the dangerous effects of total isolation and what effect that would have on the human psyche. And most of the participants actually in the study committed suicide. It's very sad to mention. And the Supreme Court didn't really come in to even make a mention of solitary confinement until about 1890. And even they, in their findings, found that solitary confinement reduced mental capacity and physical capabilities. And so we really see solitary confinement kind of, I guess, become more normalized, and I guess go through a boom, if you will, is when they create the Alcatraz federal prison out there on the West Coast in 1934. And in Alcatraz, there was a section in the prison known as D Block, and that was actually where the solitary confinement prisoners were housed. It was also known as the Hole. There, in that place, you would be stripped naked and held in a room made of entirely concrete. They would slip just little bits of food through a small hole in a door, and you were forced to use another hole in the floor. But then, so the goal of this was just not to restrict the inmates, and to house them. It was also to punish them and completely humiliate them. And after Alcatraz closes, we see in the 60s that the solitary confinement still continues, and it actually, you find these even supermax prisons that are made to almost exclusively house inmates in solitary confinement.
Okay, round two. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right. ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
And I mean, if you're wondering, and I'm sure, I mean, I'm not. There's plenty of jail shows out there, and people have probably seen, all the different things. And if there is an amazing documentary on Netflix. It's a documentary about a man by the name of Khalif Browder. It is really sad, but it's basically, I think he ends up going to jail. And I'm not even sure if he was even supposed to be in jail, but he gets put in solitary confinement for years, waiting trial. Finally ends up, I believe, getting acquitted or getting out. And it's just so, his mind is so gone, not gone, but he can't, there's too much stimulation from what the world is that he can't take it. And he ends up committing suicide. And it's just a really sad story that shows all the bad things that come from solitary confinement. It's not just about housing people and getting them off the streets and that they're going to fix themselves inside. It's a lot of things happening to people's brains while they're in there. There's been a lot of studies that show that it is barbaric. It's even worse than physical pain. When you're in there, there's no indication of time or the outside world, which leads inmates to feel forgotten. Even forces them to question their existence. You can get really existential in there. Inmates usually develop some sort of anxiety and depression and become deranged. It's so I would definitely recommend that documentary if you haven't seen it. I think it's still on Netflix. I'm not sure. We'll move on from that to capital punishment, and just the couple different things about it, really, and then that's pretty much going to be it. I did some research on the electric chair, lethal injection. The electric chair is a very interesting one because I think what I found the most interesting, it's not funny, but they had nicknames for their electric chairs. I would have just never seen that. I wouldn't have expected that. I'll give you a couple names before we actually get to explaining the history, just because I think it's funny. Let's see, where are they at? The nicknames are Gruesome Gertie, Old Sparky, Old Smoky, and Yellow Mama. Yellow Mama is probably the weirdest one to me for a number of reasons. First off, that they gave a matriarchal role, and it's killing somebody. That's one. And then two, it's named Yellow Mama because they painted it with the same paint that they used to make the traffic stripes on the road, like the yellow lines. That's where the yellow. If you look it up, you'll see it's a yellow chair. It's like who thought of that? Who was like, you know what this chair needs? It needs high visibility paint on it is what it needs. But so basically we'll see what the beginning of the electric chair starts around the 1870s, 1880s with the spread of arc lighting as a brilliant way to like light the outdoors and street lightings, and it would come in a range of 3,000 to 6,000 volts. People were amazed by it. They also were getting killed by it, and there was even a little phenomenon of people wanting to touch it because it would give you the tingles. Similar to the idea of like if you've ever put your tongue in a 9-volt battery, and it's like that little the little jolt. You want that, and so that was happening. People were doing that, and it led people to understand that electricity can actually kill somebody, and it won't like leave a mark in some cases. And this is fully illustrated by the account of what is this guy? Was he a dock worker? I think there's no docks in Buffalo. I don't think he's from Buffalo in the 1881. Let's see, he was he was a dock worker. Okay, he was a man named by the George Smith, and he was looking for that thrill, that tingling sensation, that stick your tongue in a 9-volt battery thrill, and he actually snuck into the Brush Electric Company and grabbed onto a guardrail that was just full of electricity, and he held on too tight, and it killed him. He died instantly and was discovered by the staff. His corpse was still holding on to, I believe, the generator that he was touching. But the main thing that got people and made them want to be like, whoa, this is some brand new technology, is that he was dead, but there was no outward like appearance of his death. There was no explosion out of his brain, and he wasn't bleeding through his eyes or something like that. Like, he was just dead. And so they were like, this is the newfangled way to kill people and not have it be so gruesome. And so the guy who did the autopsy on this guy, Mr. Smith, that's the guy who died. He ended up doing a lecture later on, and there was a dentist in the crowd of that lecture, a man by the name of Alfred P. Southwick. And he also was an engineer before he was a dentist. And so when you heard the lecture about the lecturer being electrocuted and outward features being affected, he, along with a guy named George E. Fell, started to work on trying to do that himself. And he started with dogs, as people want to do for some reason. And they electrocuted hundreds of dogs to try to figure out what's the perfect way to electrocute somebody to death. I mean, this is the only way to say it. I guess it's all in the name of science. I don't like it. If you're wondering, I'm a dog lover. I don't like to read this, but that's what they did. They ran trials on dogs and even horses. They would do this for a while until they got the numbers right, and then they tried it on people. Basically, they did the calculations, and like I said, they did it with dogs, and eventually, like, the first person to die, which we're gonna get into his story. The day before he died, before they killed him, they tried it out on a horse. So the first guy to ever actually get killed by the electric chair was a man by the name of William Kimmler. And he, if you're wondering, killed his girlfriend in a drunken rage. And the New York Times is quoted here as saying that he was a vegetable peddler in the slums of Buffalo, an alcoholic, and on March 29th of 1889, he was recovering from a binge the night before when he became enraged with his girlfriend, old Tilly Ziegler, and he basically went out to the shed, came back with a hatchet, and then just hacked old Tilly up, killed her. And then he went over to his neighbor's house and said, "I just killed my girlfriend." End quote. That's all from the New York Times. But believe it or not, he actually appealed his death only because the electric chair was considered at that time as new technology to be cruel and unusual. And we'll find that with most death techniques are at some point considered to be cruel and unusual. And basically, when it was done so, the judges who presided over it were like, yeah, we kind of know it is. Anything like this is going to be that way, so let's kind of just get on with it. And so when he sat down to get electrocuted, he was quoted as saying, I believe it was, "Take your time, get it right," something to that effect. And when they did it the first time, it did not work. It did not work. He was still breathing. They shot like 3,000 volts through him. They thought he was dead. Turns out he was breathing. They shot more volts through him. It said his blood vessels under his skin started to explode. It said his hair kind of tinged. Some people say his hair caught on fire. Most journalists say it was just smoking, which, I mean, semantics at that point, really, But yeah, that wouldn't be the only botched execution. There's a couple that I have here. I don't think I'm going to read any actually, but they will be on the website. The electric chair is still legally on the books in a number of states. That I did not know and was very surprising to find out. Places like South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, and Tennessee, which I think we'd probably have guessed that. In most states, though, they allow the inmate to choose his death. Either you can do the electric chair or the lethal injection. If you're wondering who was the last person to be electrocuted, it was a man by the name of Nicholas Todd Sutton, and it happened in February 2020. Was it now 3 years ago? So 3 years ago was the most recent time that a man was put to death by the electric chair. He was actually a serial killer who killed 3 people, one of which was his own grandmother. Let's see, we got one more piece of electric chair information before we get onto the gas chamber, and then we're almost done, folks. We're pretty much out of here. So the youngest person to ever be executed in the electric chair was a man, or a boy, a child by the name of George Stinney. He was 14 years old. He was accused of murdering 2 white kids in 1944. He would later actually be acquitted in 2014, but he was so small that he had to sit on a Bible to fit in the chair properly. And the mask was too large for his face, and it slipped off throughout the process. Just, if we're going to talk about it, we got to talk about it. It's there. It's out there. Sad things do happen. That'll move us on to the gas chamber, which I'll be honest, I did not think actually existed. I mean, well, I knew it existed, like in the sense of like Nazis and the Holocaust, but I did not know. I'd heard about it in movies. You watch old movies, they'll be like, oh, if you do this, they're gonna send you to the gas chamber, and I just thought they were talking about like the boogeyman or something, but like this, it actually occurred, and we'll find the true precursors really do come from the Haitian Revolution of the late 1700s and early 1800s. We covered that. I forget in what capacity we covered the Haitian Revolution, but we definitely did. I believe it was voodoo. It was voodoo we covered on the Haitian Revolution. So if you want to go back and check that out, but a man by the name of General Rochambeau was in 1803 was the first person to come up with the idea he would fill cargo holds of ships with sulfur dioxide and use it to suffocate prisoners of war. So he was just like, put them all in this room, we'll put this gas in here and they'll die. And so that was the impetus for the gas chamber itself. And of course, would go on to be used by, like I said, the Nazis, and even would be a form of capital punishment in America for at least maybe 40 years. I don't think it is still in use now. Let's see, I do have the history here, so I could be lying right now. But one of the main ways of doing it is hydrogen cyanide. The person will be strapped into a chair in an airtight chamber, and then the executioner would put a pellet into a bath of water and sulfuric acid, basically, and that would create a chemical reaction that would make the hydrogen gas, and that kills the person. So the first state to actually adopt the gas chamber as a method of execution was the state of Nevada in 1921, and they did so because they thought it was a more humane form of capital punishment. That seems to be, all of these evolutions are always trying to find a more humane way to kill people, which I'm just like, is there a humane way to kill someone? Jury's still out, I guess. By the 50s, 11 different states had use of the gas chamber. But by the 21st century, only 2 states were still using it. I believe it was California and Missouri. And it was similar to the idea with the electric chair, whereas you could choose if you wanted that or not. Well, let's see. And then our last little bit of information here will be about lethal injection, and then we'll move on to the roundup and our other segments here. So it's interesting to note that lethal injection was actually first proposed in the late 1800s by a doctor in New York who thought it would be cheaper than hanging people, but nobody really listened, and it wouldn't actually go into practice until the Nazis did it. So basically, the Nazis got really good at killing, which is that's not news to anybody, but they were the first ones to really actually they created what was called the Action T4 euthanasia program to use to kill people. And I actually this is interesting. I just visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. like 2 weeks ago for my birthday. It was last week. I'm not even sure. And there's an entire exhibit on this program where they basically got the doctors to all work in cahoots with the Nazis and to just kill a bunch of people, kill babies, kill people who were disabled and people who they thought because the actual like the slogan for this was called Leben unwürdig Leben, which is German for life unworthy of life. So the whole idea was, we're going to kill these people because they're not living a life that's even worth living. And it's like, who gets to decide that? But so that is where we get the real beginnings of lethal injection. It's interesting to note that even in Britain, they was on the books to start lethal injection as well in the late 40s and 50s, but it was ruled out after pressure from the British Medical Association. And so we don't see it really actually brought into use until the late 70s, when Oklahoma's state medical examiner Jay Chapman proposes a brand new idea, which had actually been proposed 100 years prior, of an intravenous saline drip that would go into the prisoner's arm, which would be used to introduce a lethal injection of basically different cocktail drugs that would kill him. Yeah. And so they were the first people to actually create lethal injection was Oklahoma. The actual mixture was done. The initial mixture was made by an anesthesiologist who worked at used to work at the head of the anesthesiology at Oklahoma University. His name was Stanley Deutsch. And so pretty much after that, it kind of spread through the entire country and became the norm. It was Nebraska was the last country, or the last state to actually start to use it. They only until 2009, where they were still doing it the electric chair, and it was the only way of their only form of capital punishment until their constitution actually deemed it to be unconstitutional during that year. So the drugs that are used for the lethal injection are a mixture of pancuronium bromide, and that is used to cause muscle paralysis and respiratory arrest. And then there's potassium chloride, and that stops the heart. And then there's midazolam, and that's for sedation. So all three of those come together to make the cocktail that kills people. And what happens is they actually put two tubes, there's one in each arm, that shoots it in there, but only one is needed, but the other one is kind of a backup in case it doesn't work the first time. But yeah. And that is how prisons happened. And now it's time for the roundup. And we're going to round it up. The first prisons were used to hold debtors and others who were awaiting punishment. The first prisons were usually dungeons and or sewers. London is known as the birthplace of the modern prison. The American prison system has its roots in Pennsylvania. Things I didn't know before, and now I know them. Never heard of these things. What are they? All right, so this segment, this week's things I didn't know before is going to be. I feel like I always hit a little bit different because I feel like this one's always evolving as opposed to what it could be. I thought the first thing I'll mention is I didn't talk too much about hanging in this one as a way of capital punishment, but hanging has a long history of being used to kill people who have done wrong to be punished and things like that. I thought I would mention in here the last person to be hung, or actually it's called hanged, to be hanged in America was a man by the name of Bill Bailey in 1996 in Delaware. And so I would have never thought, I didn't know that even in the 90s people were still being hung. And so basically he had the choice in the same way that we talked about with the other types of capital punishment when they were first coming about. He was sentenced to death row in 1980. And at that time, I think it was still on the books, but he could choose to either do lethal injection or be hung. And his words were saying he didn't want to be quote unquote put to sleep. He wanted the real deal. He went on kind of a crime spree of sorts to get his punishment. It wasn't like that. I mean, he killed a couple. He killed a family, a husband and wife, and he forged some documents. He did a little robbery, but nothing crazy. And his last meal was a well-done steak, baked potato with sour cream, buttered rolls, and then vanilla ice cream. And that got me thinking about other people's last meals, like other inmates' last meals, and even some just famous people's last meals. It interests me a lot, so I figured out that's what's going to happen for this week's segment of things that I didn't know before. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the last meals of certain inmates and celebrities who have passed away. And so we get to Timothy McVeigh, who of course did the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And his last meal, he just wanted 2 pints of Ben & Jerry's mint chocolate chip ice cream. That's all he wanted, and he ate both of them evidently. John Wayne Gacy's last meal was KFC, French fries, and deep fried shrimp, and a pound of strawberries. And I will say, after all these meals start to sound good, that sounds really good. Ted Bundy, he refused his last meal, and he was given steak and eggs and hash browns, but he didn't eat that either. Let's see, there was a woman by the name of Velma Barfield who was she was considered to be the death row granny. She was put to death by lethal injection in 1984. Her last meal was a bag of cheese doodles and Coke. So Coca-Cola and some cheese doodles, some Cheetos. Pretty interesting. Let's see. A man in the 90s by the name of James Edward Smith, he actually asked for a lump of dirt for his last meal, but they wouldn't give it to him since dirt was not on the list of approved foods that the prison could serve. He was given yogurt instead. And then this next guy, he is the actual reason why inmates in Texas no longer get a last meal option. This guy just ran the gambit. His name is Lawrence Brower, and he wanted 2 chicken fried steaks and gravy with sliced onions, a triple patty bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, a bowl of fried okra with ketchup, a pound of barbecued meat, half a loaf of white bread, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, 1 pint of Bluebell ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge crushed with peanuts. And to wash it all down, he wanted 3 root beers. When he got all of this stuff, he claimed that he wasn't hungry. And so basically Texas was like, well, if that's how you're going to do, then nobody gets last meals. It's actually really sad, but he did all that and just didn't even eat it. It's, I guess, his FU, his middle finger to the man. Let's see, the last one that I have 2 more for prisoners, but Saddam Hussein, basically his last meal before he was hung for his stuff, he ate chicken and rice with hot water mixed with honey. That was just, I just thought that was so bland. There's one guy in 2009 named Philip Workman who was convicted of killing a police officer in Nashville. He asked that instead of his last meal, they donate a vegetarian pizza to a homeless shelter, and the prison wouldn't do that. But his wishes got out, and all the homeless shelters in the surrounding area got just inundated with pizzas because of that. I thought that was actually really cool. It was a way to kind of give back. I mean, I think he's the only one that I read where it actually positively affected other people outside of him. So that I thought was really cool. Now we'll get to the last meals of just some people just in life, celebrities. We'll talk about JFK's last meal, Brittany Murphy's last meal, Abraham Lincoln. Our first guy up is James Dean, who was the famous actor from a long time ago. His last meal was apple pie and a glass of milk, and he ate that at a diner right before he got into a crash that killed him, basically. Abraham Lincoln had a meal before he went to the theater and got murdered, and his meal consisted of Virginia fowl with chestnut stuffing, baked yams, and cauliflower smothered in cheese sauce. It just sounds so good. Like I said, after that he would go to the Ford Theater where he would, meet his fate. JFK had a breakfast at the Hotel Texas before he was killed, and his breakfast consisted of 2 hard-boiled eggs and toast with marmalade on the side, and coffee and orange juice. I don't know. I just find this stuff a little bit interesting because you never know what's going to be your last meal. I mean, some cases, like the prisoners in this case, they know it's going to be their last meal. But for these guys, you never know, what your last meal is going to be. And it's just, I don't know, it's insignificant but significant at the same time. Brittany Murphy's last meal before she died unexpectedly in 2009 was noodles, which Thai noodles and Gatorade, which is just... it's kind of sad. I hope that's not my last meal. One more before we get you out of here. Jimi Hendrix's last meal before he died, I believe it was asphyxiation. Not asphyxiation. He died of choking on his own vomit, I believe. He had a tuna fish sandwich made for him by his girlfriend. That was his last meal. So think about that when you go out to eat, or when you're eating your food today. You're like, is this gonna be my last one? Is this what they're gonna write down about me? Because my last meal was chili, and I don't know if I want that to be my last meal. All right, that was another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH, always. All right, that was another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH. Learned a lot about prisons. There's so much information that honestly I leave some of that out because I don't want to just drone. And so I'll try to bring up whatever I may have missed in the mini episode next week, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. I learned a lot about electric chairs, capital punishment. The craziest thing to me is that I did not know they named these chairs. That just Old Sparky and Yellow Mama are just, that's what I'll leave here with. But if you love what you heard here, there's more over at hdthappen.com. As always, you'll find the written version of what you just heard, as well as photos and videos to help me create the episode. And like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It always helps the pod grow. Give us 5 stars if you want to, or 2 stars, and tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars. That always works as well. As always, thanks for pressing play, and we'll see you guys with the next As always, thanks for pressing play, and we'll see you guys with the next episode of Bite Size Bios.
Okay, round two. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right. ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply. See website for details.